Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Jennifer Schmitt, Senior Research Scientist in Sustainable Food Systems and Fellow at the Institute on the Environment. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this People and Planet conversation. People and Planet is a public series launched as a space to have wide-ranging conversations about the many intersections of climate and the human and natural systems that shape our world. Before we start, I want to begin by acknowledging that the Institute on the Environment offices, like the rest of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, sits on the traditional and treaty land of the Dakota people, land that was taken from Native people. As a scholarly community committed to building a sustainable future, it is particularly important to acknowledge the Dakota people on whose land we live, learn, and work. We also understand that the Dakota, Ojibwe, and other Indigenous knowledge systems are crucial ways of knowing. We honor the people who keep that Indigenous knowledge. Taking a moment to acknowledge the land that we're on helps us recognize the harms and mistakes of the past and the benefits that have accrued to settlers, including my own ancestors. Recognizing the truth of colonialism is important in healing and reconciliation, and it is needed for respectful partnerships with Indigenous people. This is ongoing work. IonE commits to improving and strengthening university relationships with our tribal nations. I myself have committed to listening more and amplifying the voices of the colonized and the oppressed, and as one small step in changing the harmful extractive history of this land. Because of this, I cannot sit before you today and offer a sincere land acknowledgement without also crying out for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. I am excited that the topic of corn has brought us all here today, and I want to honor the role corn and food in general plays in bringing people together. Food, including corn, is more than its nutritional components. It's part of our heritage, our culture. It can be how we show love or connect with one another. My wish for today is that we push into difficult questions around corn, but we do so with the respect and compassion that we each deserve as human beings. With that, I have a couple of very quick logistical notes. If you have questions for our speakers, we're reserving some time toward the end of the discussion. Please add all questions to the Q&A feature in this webinar. For those in person, go to slido.com and enter code number 2067746, and we'll work to incorporate as many of the questions as we can. Also, we are recording the conversation and will share this along with any other resources mentioned in the follow-up message later this week. Now, we're going to start off with having each of our speakers introduce themselves and share with us how their life, professionally and personally, intersects with corn. And I'll have Becky start for us, please.
All right, Sagoli Sagwake, Ganyata Gelu Niunget Sungwe Huene, Becky Webster Niunget Sot Slunige, Wagwaho Niwagit Talode, Oniote Aga Niwakahuan Jot, Delunkawane Niwagenu. So what I just said in English is, greetings, my friends. My name is Ganyata Gale, which means snow scattered here and there. My English name is Becky Webster. I'm Wolf Clan, I'm Oneida, and I grew up near Duck Creek that runs through the Oneida Reservation. I am an associate professor at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, in the Department of American Indian Studies, as well as the director of graduate studies for our department. And my research interests focus on tribal administration and food sovereignty, but my relationship with corn goes all the way back to my childhood, eating corn soup, mush, and Gunastohal. That prompted our family to start growing our corn in 2015, so we're relatively new growers. The following year, we formed a co-op, which is now 15 Oneida families that we grow several acres of corn together. The year after that, we bought some property to expand our agricultural efforts. We have a YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. We host all kinds of classes. 2 years ago, we were able to form a 501c3 called Ungwakwa, which means Our Foods. And somewhere amongst all of that, I had the time to write a book about corn. So you'll probably hear a little bit about that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Pedro, can you join us?
Hello, everybody. Well, I'm Pedro Urriola. I'm a faculty at the Department of Animal Sciences of the University of Minnesota. And my research and expertise are dedicated to mitigate the environmental impact of livestock operation, with particular focus on primarily 4 focus areas. One is optimizing livestock diets. My first area of that is like how we can decrease the footprint associated with producing the food that we feed to our animals. This involves enhancing the efficiency of feed formulation, particularly with cereal grains like corn, and we'll talk more of details about that. But also, I actively work involved in efforts to combat infectious diseases among livestock, because healthier animals do not only suffer less from those diseases, but also consume less resources to, for example, corn to achieve a target weight. So healthier animals are in general more sustainable. The third area is centers about promoting circularity. How can we get products that are maybe a co-product from use of, for example, corn to other human activities, like, for example, ethanol production? How can we then bring that back into feeding animals and do that on a more efficient way? And then lastly, I'm committed to maintaining integrity of corn trade. In the US, we both export and import corn. My work involves preventing the introduction of foreign animal diseases or import diseases, because this is important to safeguard the businesses and the operations or the health of animals in the US. And on a personal side, I'm from a country called Venezuela. In Venezuela, we consume corns in different ways, and the most common is eating arepas, and later we can share more about it.
Excellent. Thank you, Pedro. Joanne, can you join us?
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me. I have a kind of a different journey. I'm a professor at the Department of Food Science and Nutrition. I'm also a dietitian. I work in whole grains. I publish a lot of research on grains and other nutrients, but I grew up on a farm in on North Walworth Road that I still own and manage, and have some examples here of our neighbors who do rent our land and try to make a living out there. So when I go back to my original corn experiences, we had like a 2-row planter and probably a 3-row, it looks so retro at the time. We had 24 cows, and we took the silage from the corn, put it in a silo, and fermented it. So we were really way ahead of our time at the time. So I find corn has always been incredibly important for feeding the animals we had on our farm, but also is a big part of our diet. So obviously sweet corn, growing it and putting it into our food. And then as time has gone by, we realize that corn has fats, it has proteins, it has carbohydrates, so we can make it into a lot of food additives and put it into the food supply too. So incredibly versatile product that is out there, and we are fortunate here in the Midwest to be able to grow it. It's a very efficient plant. So happy to be here to talk about corn.
Excellent. I'm so excited to talk with you all. And I'm going to do some round robin questions. Joanne, please stay on video because I'm going to shoot the first question back to you, actually. When people look at a food label, what ingredients do they see that are actually derived from corn? Do all of these ingredients come from the same type of corn?
Yeah, interesting question. Corn can be made into so many things. It's a pretty versatile standalone. We never want to talk in nutrition that one food can keep you going, but some of the old studies on single grains, corn kind of beat out every other grain because it has a good mixture of fats, carbohydrates, and protein in it. So if you look on labels, you'll see corn oil. Corn oil is almost a byproduct of corn. It's not really the highest thing, but it's something we can get out of it. It is highly unsaturated, pretty positive fat. Cornstarch is in everything. Every time you make gravy or anything, any type of thickening, cornstarch would be there. And then of course, corn sweeteners. So like if you look at starch is the long chain carbohydrate. We can hydrolyze it either in the body or in a plant and make it into sweeteners. So once people could figure that out, they're like, hey, we can take starch from corn and turn it into a sweetener. And all of these things, as we move down the path of are people starving or are people, do they need food or are they overweight? They have it's kind of a double-edged sword. So whenever we say, hey, we can get fat out of corn and give you, fry your food, we can take sugar out of corn, put it in your sweets. It's like, hey, you're bad because you're giving us these extra calories. So I just think when and now we're seeing corn protein is pretty high quality too. So as people are like, hey, we need more plant proteins isolated that we want to put into foods, you see interest in isolating the protein. So all of those components within corn are part of why it's almost a complete nutrition food, and how we can take those out. And, you know, a lot of it has to do, Pedro already talked about ethanol. What's the market? Where do we make the most money with the components that are in corn? So that will shift over time. And I'm sure we'll get more into that discussion. Where's the right place for corn to go in our environment?
Thank you. I want to turn to Becky. Indigenous corn is not the same as the corn that we see filling our fields nearby here in the Midwest. Not the same as the sweet corn that we get at the state fair. How is indigenous corn different? And are there a lot of varieties of it?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. One thing to keep in mind is that all corn is indigenous to the Americas. This is where corn came from. So in our stories, in our traditional stories, we say that corn was here even before people were, even before human beings. So our people have a long relationship with corn. This corn you see in those large-scale conventional fields is still our corn. However, it's probably genetically modified. But we have to think back to our relationship with corn, our indigenous relationships with that, and we see those seeds and that corn plants as our relatives. So to genetically modify them to suit our needs is for us culturally inappropriate. The way that we modify our corn over time is by selecting for those qualities in the plants and the seeds that we want to see in those future generations, and we save those, and then that's what we plant. So that process has resulted in hundreds of corn varieties over countless generations. So one of the things that I had learned from one of my seed mentors is that, so we had a small patch of Haudenosaunee black sweet corn. So it's a very short, wrinkly little cob, because when sweet corn dries out, it gets wrinkly. Most of the corn that we grow is either a flint or a flower corn, meaning when they're dried, they still have pretty plump kernels. And there were some very big cobs in there. There were 2 large cobs, and I pulled them out, and I pulled back the husks, and they were these beautiful purple and white speckled kernels in there. And I talked to my seed mentor, and she says, yes, every now and then out of your field, you're going to have a random cob pop up, something that you did not plant. Now, conventional science will talk about that's cross-pollination, but our original instructions tell us that that's the corn remembering her relatives. So we kept some of those and have been growing them out. Actually, this corn right here is the result of that corn, this beautiful purple and white speckled calico corn now. And our Oneida chief here in our community named this corn Degunda Dale, which means the women, the older women, they're remembering the other women. So those were our varieties come from.
Thank you. Pedro, let's switch to feed corn, or the corn that we give to our livestock. It's not usually the same corn we eat, although I feel like I recently learned that we use this corn for tortillas, perhaps. But maybe you can tell us more about how this corn is different that we feed to our livestock in this country.
Yes, you know, Rebecca talked about the kernel and how the kernels stay thick or thick during after drying, and the most common corn that we feed to livestock is called dent, yellow dent corn, and the reason is that as it dries, it has a depression in the middle, and that depression then makes it different from flint corn, the other corn. Typically, for example, that yellow dent corn has less sugars and is less sweet than sweet corn. Is harvested at maturity, and therefore it will be drier than the corn that we use for consumption of sweet corn. The yellow dent corn has typically higher yields than the other varieties of corn, including flint corn, but has other distinctions with flavor or taste. And in livestock, the one that we feed most is that yellow dent corn, is the one that actually we export to markets and things like that.
Excellent. I'm going to stick with you for a minute, Pedro. Why do we feed so much corn to livestock in this country? And is that something that is common across the globe?
Yeah, maybe starting from the back, it's not common around the world. I mean, a lot of people feed corn to livestock, and however, for example, in areas where there's more drought, let's say Mexico, they may tend to feed more sorghum because sorghum is better adapted to grow in dry conditions than corn, for example. But let's continue to the comparison of sorghum. For example, sorghum, we have tannins, and tannins have bitter taste and also decrease the digestibility of amino acids and protein. And like Joanne was saying, corn has an excellent source of protein, but also a lot of starch. And that starch has a lot of energy. It pounds a lot of calories in a small amount. The calories that we get from starch are really useful and very digestible. So most animals will do very well consuming corn, and therefore we feed that to pigs. So it has low concentration or no anti-nutritional factors and has a lot of calories per unit of corn. And the yield itself is higher than other grains. So for example, barley and wheat will have lower yield per hectare than corn. So you have something that has high energy and give you high yields per hectare. Therefore, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And the protein profile of corn matches very well with the protein profile of soybeans or soybean meal, that when you mix the two together, they match the requirement of most monogastric animals like chickens and pigs very well. So that's another tricky reason or another reason why that complementary between you have something that provides you energy, amino acids in a ratio that when you mix it with something else, give you a package of amino acids that are very good and useful for the animals, and has a high yield per hectare.
I want to jump in, Jennifer, just to say thank you for talking about the complementary protein and to think about the monogastrics like us are the people that the animals that are competing with us. So for us and pigs and chickens, corn is a really good food, but for ruminants, they can live on a much lower quality food. So every animal, we're like, okay, what can they be consuming? And it has to be variable, as Pedro talked about, the cost of that, the yield of these, all those things turn into the profitability of what I'm going to feed my animal. But corn is it's got fat, it's got pretty high quality protein, and generally the cost is very cost neutral or good. So in putting it with soybeans, generally those are complementary proteins and you have a complete protein at a fairly low cost. So I think a lot of people have gone to corn, and since we can produce it at a large scale, and it's, this idea of sweet corn versus dent corn, we used to just eat dent corn before it got, because it's the same product. Corn is corn. But, this idea when it dries down, then it's actually more stable and, it's not going to rot. So sweet corn, you have to process it, put it in a can, make sure that it's safe because it's not, not food safe because it's a vegetable and it is perishable.
And to be clear, before we move on, Pedro, and Joanne, that we still give corn to the ruminants. I mean, cattle are finished on corn.
Well, I was going to say too, like when we used to give corn, we ground up the whole, they actually ate the cob and they ate so depending on how you're feeding ruminants, as opposed to just corn, shelled corn, where all your nutrients are. So if you want the fiber that's in the cob, you want the fiber that is in the stalk, that can be fed to ruminants and they can do really well on it. So the idea to give ruminants straight corn, I would say very few people would be feeding that because that would be too expensive. So if you have options for more fiber and low quality food that the rest of us can't eat, you would be more likely to use that in a ruminant. But if you're going to finish off, your point too, Jennifer, is that a lot of times people like the taste of animals that are finished off with more of a corn hit at the end. So whatever you want to say that. But.
Yeah, so most people, like Joanne said, will feed corn silage, and that silage is then the whole plant corn harvest and then fed later to the animals. But the grain itself, because now in the grain, in the kernel, you have a lot of starch. And to ruminants, you need to be careful because if you feed a lot of that starch, the microbes in the rumen, so the rumen is this compartment that is before the stomach of the animal, right? The microbes there will start to ferment very rapidly and cause something called rumen acidosis that is deleterious to the health of steers. So most farmers will limit amount of corn kernel or starch that they put in the diet of the animals, because then it will cause this acidosis. But you also want the flavors, like Joanne was saying, because then it increases accumulation of fat in the marbling and everything. So it's something that for years people have tried to and work towards finding a balance.
Excellent. I was having the same thought as a Q&A that's popped up, and Becky, sorry, this is not a pre-sent question, but curious about if there's a tradition of feeding corn to livestock within the Oneida histories. And I did see in your book at one point a mention of feeding some corn to horses. So can you illuminate a little bit kind of the role that corn has for livestock in the Oneida space?
Historically, we didn't keep livestock, so no. We would recognize that of course, after contact and the introduction of, that type of an agricultural lifestyle, then of course we fed corn just like everybody else did. But I think before contact, we recognized that all of creation, there needs to be a balance in there. So we can't really always necessarily get upset when, the raccoons or the squirrels or the deer or the blue jays take a share of our corn, recognizing that later on, that venison is going to be finished with corn. So it might be a little tastier. So all of it is with balance. So.
Excellent. I'm going to stick with you, Becky. And I think we've kind of touched on this, but give you an opportunity. I feel like a lot of the conversation we have around conventional corn talks about what some of the things that Pedro and Joanne have mentioned, nutrient value, yield, water use, efficiency, price. How do you think about corn production?
Yeah, so those terms are a bit strange to me, just because our goals in growing food are very different than conventional farming. So like first, we're reestablishing our relationship with our corn relatives. We're fulfilling our responsibilities to care for the corn, and in return, she is caring for us. And second, we already know that our heirloom corn is nutritious because modern science has confirmed what we have known for generations. Third, we want to make sure we're doing our best to heal the soil that has been damaged by conventional farming. Like our farmstead here, we purchased 10 acres in 2017, had some soil tests. It's some of the most damaged soil they've ever seen, they said. So we have a lot of repair work to do. We don't use any artificial fertilizers, herbicides, or pesticides. So that can be a bit tricky to manage what's happening here while still working on that repairing. And fourth, it's really difficult to put a price on our corn because she's so labor intensive to grow. So in a good year, 1 hour of work gives us just 2 pounds of corn. And that doesn't count the value of the land, the organic fertilizer that we use, the equipment that we use and maintain, or even the time it takes to prepare that raw corn for eating. That's just the raw corn itself. And then lastly, we want to grow corn to share with our community. So sometimes that does mean taking advantage of modern technology like tractors and the two-row planters and the pickers. But at the same time, we also want to preserve our traditional agricultural methods of planting and harvesting by hand. So it's all about balance. It's all about understanding how we have historically done this and why we do that, while recognizing that a lot of us, we have desk jobs. We're not all going to be out there in the field working all day. So we need to be able to have our people have access to these foods while still keeping that traditional knowledge.
Thank you. Pedro, I'm going to turn back to you. How does feeding corn to livestock affect the environmental impact of animal agriculture?
Yeah, any of the grains that we grow to feed livestock will have some environmental impact of doing that production, or so whether it's corn, wheat, barley, or rice, and each of the environmental impacts may be different because of the different conditions of that producing that grain. For example, rice in rice paddies, then we have methane production from those rice paddies that is sometimes even greater than the methane production or nitrous oxide production from, or the emissions from soil where we plant corn. The benefit, as I mentioned before, of corn is that it has high yield. And so if you say need to feed, let's say 100 animals, then something that has high yield and packs a lot of energy will help you to raise those 100 animals with fewer hectares, for example, than something else that have lower yield, for example, right? Or packs less energy. So corn has been very effective at giving us those calories that the animals need, the complementary of the protein, as we said before, and the high yields to pack a lot of nutrients to feed the animals. In fact, if we were to take those calories or that same amount of animals that we need to feed, and we were feeding, for example, something like wheat or barley, we'll need about 3 to 4 times more hectares just to feed the same numbers of animals than if we were to do that the same with corn. But for example, in Canada, their growing conditions is better suited for wheat and barley. So even though they will need more land to produce the same amount of animals, but that's the conditions that they have. Or in Mexico, sorghum have lower yield and less energy. However, they can grow sorghum because they have less water. So it is always all depends on the context of where we are raising the animals and what we are doing. But yeah, so that's how environmental impact of producing corn comes from the fertilizers. So producing the ammonia, for example, or the fertilizers that we use. The Haber-Bosch procedure is an energy-intense procedure, very effective fixing that nitrogen from the air and then making it available for us to grow the crops, but it's an energy-intense process. And then that nitrogen, if is in the soil and depending on certain conditions, it can produce or convert it to nitrous oxide, and those emissions will have an environmental impact as well. Or if it leach and nitrates go into the water, it may contaminate water sources too. So there are different ways to follow that, that there is an environmental impact, and there are different ways to manage that environmental impact. But in general, I think something that has high yield and packs a lot of nutrients is helpful to producing, because the goal has been to produce amount of food, right?
Thank you. Joanne, I know we're going to push a little outside of your general area, but you've got a farm and there's human corn being grown on it. I'm just curious about the production of sweet corn or popcorn or the corn on your farm, or what you know of in general of human consumed corn. And I'm not talking, again, kind of the pieces that are more like the animal corn, but what are the environmental concerns? Are they similar to the corn dent 2 yellow corn that animals have, or are we not fertilizing it as much, or are we not using genetically modified impact? What do you know?
Yeah, no, I think that Pedro did a good job of explaining trade-offs. Everything's a trade-off. You win one, you lose one. And I think yield is obviously, if we get this much yield and we get a really nutritious product, that tends to be a crop that's going to be grown and expanded, especially when there's a market. In our farm, our neighbors, the Pierces, have a farm stand and they farm our land. And we're lucky we have a canning factory that is right near us. So we've had peas grown there and sweet corn grown there that would go to the canning factory. Everything you look at though, and this is a contract that, we just rent the land, so we're not involved in the contract. But last year, because of the drought, They have to plant the corn exactly at the right time, and then they have to harvest it. And actually, because of the growing conditions, everything had to get just plowed under. Like they have like a very short time to come and harvest the sweet corn. And it was like, nope, we can't do it. We're going to just, and that's the same thing like with pumpkins. We've had pumpkins growing on our farm. So if the marketing and all of these challenges of agriculture, I know, when Becky was talking about, I have a desk job, so do I. My dad always said, hey, get a job where you work inside. Agriculture is really hard to make money, and it's very challenging financially. So you take a lot of risk, and you don't even know what your price is going to be for corn. You get insurance, you do everything. And then I think that's a challenging thing. So when people say, hey, we're going to get into popcorn, that's a different market. And I think all of those are very exciting for some of the people that say, hey, we want to get into alternatives. We want to get into organic. I think there's huge opportunities. So, just this idea, some of the things Becky talked about with traditional corns, different colors. We just published a paper on bioactive in plants that is beyond fiber, and there's all these other interesting protective compounds that are in plants that we want to promote. So we're fortunate in Wisconsin and Minnesota, can pretty much grow anything. And I think Pedro did a good job of explaining that. Places in Mexico, other places in Africa, they just don't have the ability. And some of the things we go after and say, well, we would never, like palm or coconut, if you look at where people in Africa, they have to grow things that actually grow in environments without water, with too much heat, and without equipment. So kind of being a little more flexible and saying, hey, there's a tradition there. And I agree with Becky that everything in the US is yield, because this is commercial agriculture and I need to make money. So I can only lose money so many years or I'm out of business. But kind of appreciating that there's culture and there are food likes, and that's really important too. That to just say, okay, I'm not going to make a lot of money on this popcorn. I'm not going to make a lot of money on my small thing, but it's important for my community, my culture, to invest in that. And I think corn has such a rich tradition for that. That some of the popcorns are really fun. And I have some examples here of the Pierces, because they have all these different popcorns they grow, but they also now have a microwavable bag that you can put it in. So trying to kind of get with, okay, people don't have time. They're not that interested in culture, but they still want to use the microwave. So balancing all these challenges and realizing there's no right and wrong in corn, that it's just an amazing crop.
Can I just add really quick? That resonated with me about our desk jobs. And as stated by John Mohawk, a Seneca activist and author, and has since passed on, but I just recently came across a quote of his. He says, I became a professor so I could be a farmer. And I thought, wow, does that really resonate with what we do? And a little bit on the flip side of that is we don't sell anything here. It is all on a barter system. So there is no cash. All of our seeds are heirloom. We try to do trades even for, manure if we ever have to add it, people to get fish so that we can add that to our soil. So thankfully the dollar isn't here. We're not relying on that to, pay our mortgage. That's what the university is for.
I appreciate that too, Becky, because we have all the people that want to hunt on our land too. Everybody's like, okay, if we get a deer, we'll give you some venison. So it's this bartering system of supporting your neighbors and trying to have everybody live out, because it's wonderful to be able to live in the country too. And I think once you're there, so for anybody who's been able to live on a farm, just to appreciate what the life is worth, it's really worth a ton.
Beautiful. Becky, I want to return back to you. In your book, Our Precious Corn, you talk about corn having a resurgence. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more what you mean by that.
Yeah, so just backing up real quick. So I got hired by the University of Minnesota, Duluth, based on my experience. I was an attorney for my tribe for 13 years prior to coming to Duluth. And a lot of my research was on intergovernmental relationships. And this was during that time that I was really switching over to wanting to grow our indigenous foods, and especially the corn. And I had talked to our department head about wanting to write about corn and write a book about it. And I was really nervous because, it's publish or perish in the university world, but that's not why they hired me. They hired me for tribal state government relations. And I said, hey, I'm thinking about writing this book. And I had all these arguments, but before I could even spit any of them out, she said, do it. So it was really nice that I was given the freedom to just go for it. And in that research, I found that our history really mirrors that of the corn. So in times that the Oneida people and other indigenous people suffered at the hands of colonialism, assimilation, and removal, our corn suffered as well. And even though during these dark times, she remained by our side. She's always been a part of our daily and our ceremonial lives. And in times where we flourished as a people, our corn has flourished right alongside us. So we're currently experiencing a time where we are flourishing. Our children are now born into a generation where our language, our songs, our ceremonies, it's a normal part of their life. My husband and I were both Oneida. We grew up here. That wasn't a normal part of our life here because we were still facing the impacts from, the boarding school era. So I think our community is going through a lot of healing right now, and that these kids that are coming up are coming into a world where our language is celebrated instead of hidden. Our culture is something that we acknowledge and appreciate instead of being ashamed of it. So more and more people are growing and caring for our traditional indigenous seeds. So our people and our seeds, we're thriving right now.
Beautiful. I'm going to use that and as our pivot to open up to the audience for questions for any of our panelists. Please add your questions in the Q&A feature down below, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And for those in person, again, you've got the Slido directions on the whiteboard. So let's get started, and I've got them on this screen, so forgive the head pivot here. And I'll kind of offer this to the panel, and whoever and however many of you would like to join in, feel free for the answer. So the first one, corn is mainly grown as a monocrop. Can you comment on the pros and cons? And do we need to return to growing many species together in a more resilient ecosystem?
I can take that real quick. I think this is one of those instances where modern science thinks it comes up with these things and puts them out there and look what we discovered, when in reality, our traditional way of growing our corn is alongside the other sisters, the beans and squash together. And we grow our three sisters together here on our farmstead. We grow them in mounds, and the corn grows tall and strong. The beans wrap around the corn to use the corn as a support. The beans add nitrogen to the soil through those nodules. The squash we plant around the perimeter of our plantings. Her wide leaves cover the ground to keep moisture in the soil and keep the weeds down. If anyone's ever picked squash, you know that the stems and leaves are very prickly, so it really deters a lot of the animals from wanting to venture inside. It's not a perfect system, but I think it works well. And we have a lot of traditional stories about why the corn, beans, and squash shouldn't be separated and why they should be kept together. That's not to say that we don't monocrop, because it is difficult to use conventional tools if you have a system where you have more than one crop there. But I will say, though, that with strong winds, if they've come by, that corn that has the beans and squash around it are a lot more likely to stay standing than the corn that's just in the rows.
I would want to just jump into and say I'm not an agronomist, and if my agronomy friends are here, they would talk, I think, a lot about some of the pests and the diseases that have taken out crops. And I think that's the hard thing too, when like a lot of the, and there's two sides to everything or five sides to everything in agronomy, but the yield is terribly important, but really the being able to sustain damage, not be able to be taken out by the latest, and those change all the time. And that is the frustrating thing. Every time you come up with a new technology to deal with one thing, then you develop maybe stronger other pests and other diseases and bacteria and viruses that are going to get your crop out. So it's very challenging to continue to get your yield up. And also, the IP, lucky Becky's a lawyer, so she gets this, the whole thing about who owns the seed. And there's just that whole area of the seeds and the technology and who owns it and can you keep your seed for the next year. It's terribly complicated. There's a legal process there that makes it very difficult for growers to stay on the right side of the law. So that is I was lucky to be part of the Midwest Grit, where we had a group of farmers and people trying to do alternative ag. And there's just a lot of challenges to get out of the conventional system and kind of move to the more sustainable organic or other regenerative systems.
Okay. Kind of tack to that. Our listeners were wondering, are we growing too much corn from a human and planetary health perspective? And maybe some of those non-virtuous components of corn, like the need for the nitrogen inputs and the emissions associated with that. Are we growing too much? Can we grow too much? No one wants that
I
question.
give it a shot as number one, I come from Venezuela, a country that today we don't grow the food that we consume. And therefore, when we think that are we doing too much or something, well, sometimes we need to overdo more because either there are losses in the system, there are ways that it's not used or is badly distributed. So sometimes you need to overproduce to make sure you cover everybody. You cannot say, oh, I need 1,000 pounds and I'm going to grow 1,000 pounds. Maybe you need to grow 2,000 pounds because you know that there's going to be losses, there's going to be mismanagement, or there will be other things that will decrease our ability to cover the needs. And coming from Venezuela and seeing people in line for food, I say, boy, we are still not growing enough. We still maybe need to grow more. But it's complicated because also we grow about 40% of the corn goes to biofuels. It comes back as a or co-product to feed animals too. And so depending on how you make that calculation, you can say it was raised to produce biofuels, but it was used to produce livestock. But I would say it's efficient of using it and is producing the food, and we still need to produce more food to feed more people. So I don't know if it's too much. I think we'll need to even more until we find an alternative that is as effective. And so I think that's always something that we'll continue to study.
I agree with that too. And you look at other countries where hopefully we can be a net exporter because we're lucky to have the good enough soil to grow corn. It's an amazing crop. But also I think people forget that there are, I always feel just like Becky said, you kind of feel insulted. People come in and say, hey, you guys aren't sustainable. And when we look at the corn is grown on our farm, but it's always rotated with other crops, and we use no-till, we use cover crops. So I think they're, rather than just saying corn, there's too much of it, let's get rid of it or decrease it, we still do need calories. There are people that are hungry around the world. And if we have the ability to produce a very profitable and productive plant like corn, I don't think it's time to say we are producing too much. There's still hunger in the world, and corn can be part of that solution. I agree with Pedro too, that the most estimates say 40% of it goes into putting fuel in our vehicles. So do we want to justify that? That has trade-offs too. So, there's a lot of ways of looking at that.
All right, I'm going to move on to another question that Joanne may be best for you, but again, always offer the whole panel. Someone asked, corn-based food sweeteners like high fructose corn syrup are often vilified, but are they worse for us than other sweeteners?
Oh, I get to go teach advanced human nutrition in a half hour. So I get to do these questions all the time. To me, it's really the number of calories. And so if you look at, if you're replacing sucrose with a high fructose corn sweetener, which is usually pretty close to 50% fructose, 50% glucose, as long as you're controlling calories, there's no data that it's any different at all. So if you don't need the calories, get rid of them. And I think that's in general that for people that the fact that there are tasty foods in our country that people overconsume, sweeteners in general are part of the problem, but then, the sweeteners that come from corn, there's no data that they are less healthy than straight sugar. But, food is much more than its chemical composition. And I've really grown to understand and appreciate that more, that we realize that we need sweeteners. They do everything for us. They make us pies and desserts, and they preserve our food and make jerky for us. And, so sweeteners in and of themselves are mostly positive on the food safety side too, but too much, we don't need the calories. So getting the calories to the right person, but it is, just the politics too, that sucrose sugar has a standard of identity. So for, the corn people have really tried hard to be labeled as corn sugar because they think consumers would understand that better. We are basically corn sugar. We've taken corn, made it into sugar, but there's a standard of identity. So they will never get that, I don't think. So they need to be labeled as, some type of fructose corn sweetener. And at the time when they did that, fructose, because it's higher in fruit, everybody thought that was a great marketing idea. Looking back, like most things, looking back, it's like, we should not have named ourselves that. It's only going to hurt us.
Here's a question for Becky. Do you see ways and steps for the conventional system to start embracing a more holistic way of holding and nurturing agriculture as you have described when you've talked about it? Or what wisdom for change would you share?
Yeah, so I definitely think that there's different ways to go about doing things. And for us, a lot of the things that when we're struggling with how to go about doing things, we return back to our original instructions. And those are the ways that return balance to our life. We move away from the idea that yield is something we're going for, or price is what we're going for. So as long as those two things are what's driving you, everything else is going to be left in the dust and will be damaged and hurt by that. So I think our co-op has what my husband and a friend affectionately refer to as the mad scientist field. So they're trying with all kinds of different things, different types of cover crops, interseeding, crimping and rolling. So they're just trying all kinds of different things to make sure that this soil is going to be something that we'll be able to lovingly pass on to the next generations. And while we are looking at the yield, because of course people care about that, we're trying to demonstrate that we can still produce a viable crop by using these different alternative methods. And while some of these have been proven with, the sweet corn or the field dent corn, we really haven't looked critically at these for our indigenous corn varieties that are meant specifically just for human consumption. We have our own dent corn, flint and flour corn varieties that are not genetically modified. So the cobs will grow on different heights on the stalk. They are different sizes, so it's difficult to mechanical, what is the word? Mechanize the process of harvesting and caring for them. So we just really need to get back to what our real goals are and take a critical look at why it is we're doing what we're doing.
I want to mention to Jennifer, getting kids involved and a more diverse audience into agriculture, women, people that aren't the usual, and I think that's always been a challenge. I had a wonderful background in 4-H. I had great teachers, and I think as a youth, if you learn to grow your food and you appreciate it and learn how to cook, it really helps connect you to the soil. And when we, it's hard, as Jennifer said, whole generations have kind of lost the connection. So getting people in early and connecting them to the soil and wanting them to care about it and enjoying food and enjoying sharing food and everything that comes with that community of sharing food is incredibly important.
Jennifer,
Go ahead.
I wanted to touch back on the Becky's point on the going back to sometimes the basics and the need to and sometimes in agriculture, we specialize a lot and we have one culture that we know how to grow very well. under the conditions that we have. And when those conditions deviate a little bit, then it's a train wreck. And we don't have that in livestock animals. We call that robustness, or the ability of the animal to grow or still perform on a different condition than the specific one that we were growing in. And that point that Becky was making of sometimes you need to go back to the basics is something that resonates, because it's something that we are listening now and realizing in my area of work on livestock sustainability, because, oh yeah, sometimes animals we need to have the variety in the genes, for example, so that if a disease comes or temperature changes, animals are still able to cope with the change in the environment. And sometimes those principles, we maybe take us time to realize, to come back to those principles.
That fits nicely with another question we got, that how is climate change expected to impact corn production? How does the land cover of corn affect our regional climate as well? And maybe have you seen anything already? I mean, Becky, Joanne, on your own farms.
I think climate change. Go ahead, Becky, you go first.
I was saying, yes, we have noticed drastic changes with climate change here. Everything from our traditional instructions talk about planting fish in the mounds before we plant our seeds. The fish are running at different times. They are confused because the waters are warming up and cooling off at different times than what they had normally done. We have our ceremonies according to when the maple runs and when the thunders come. Those are all getting flipped around, and it's really confusing with all of the extremes that we're facing. Normally, our traditional agricultural system is with mounds, and that's because we have very wet springs. And here in Oneida in Wisconsin, it's kind of swampy here. So we have to worry about too much water. Well, last year we had a drought, and so those traditional agricultural methods did not work well with how we were growing our foods because of the lack of water. And we actually had to pump water out of our pond into totes and then pump those totes into the gardens. And that was different than rainfall, right? Even though you have all these amazing nutrients from the pond, it came onto the field in a different way and actually washed away some of the soil, taking out some of the soil around the roots, and our corn fell over. So there's all kinds of things that can just be disrupted when our climate is no longer predictable and no longer what we are accustomed to growing under.
I totally agree with that too, with ours. Drought and then too much rain, lose everything. So, and I think it's definitely we used to have 3 ponds in our back. We have some wetlands that is in set aside through FSA, and those ponds, 2 of them have gone away. So it's kind of frightening to see how things are changing quickly and trying to do everything we can kind of get back to that. But I think climate change has arrived. It's, it's upon us, and we do need to adjust. And, huge fields of corn that are huge fields obviously have it's all part of the cycle. There's nobody who's innocent. We all need to get on board.
All right, I'm gonna kind of close out questions there. I'm sorry if we didn't get to yours, but I thank you all for submitting questions. We appreciate your curiosity in this. As we're near time, I'd like to end the discussion today with each of you sharing your perhaps one of, or your definitely favorite corn-based dish, and tell us one thing that you hope this audience takes from today and shares with others. Popcorn, whoever. The puns. Who would like to start? Pedro, please.
Yep. Well, I mentioned I come from Venezuela, and we eat arepas. This is made out of corn, and I can share the recipe and how to make them. Nowadays, we do it out of corn flour that has a process on nixtamalization, and it's much easier to do. And actually, you can live in Minnesota, being a Venezuelan, and eat a traditional food that you grew up with. I think that's the power of globalization, that you can live wherever and still eat a lot of the foods that you grew up with. And the final thought is something that I keep reminding myself that sometimes our imagination is the only limit to the things that we can do in the future. Because I thought that I would never have to call my parents on the same day. And nowadays, I just take the phone and do a FaceTime or a Zoom call anytime. And so I think that technology and innovation that comes from our imagination can take us very far and to solve the big problems that we need to solve.
Joanne?
So I put it the corn bake that came from the Home Economist and the reason I love that recipe, I have it every Thanksgiving. I have it a lot, actually. It has a can of cream corn, a can of regular corn, and it has a corn mix. And like Pedro says, I love to cook. I grew up making everything, but some of those little shortcuts are amazing. And my mom used to make corn fritters with maple syrup, still love those. So I think people, so much of nutrition, and I'm a dietitian, so I am part of the problem. We've made people feel like food is like the enemy and we're always fighting with it. So I think people enjoying your culture and understanding that it's so rich, the food history we have, and with Thanksgiving coming on, to be thankful that we live in America. We're very fortunate, and it's nice to care about other people that don't have food right now. So I think an important issue that I'm glad you brought up right at the beginning, Jennifer.
Becky?
So I shared maple berry turtle ganastohal. So this is a traditional dish that we have. I just added the turtle part of there, and it's our corn flour, berries. You can get those from the grocery store, or pick them, and then maple syrup, which is my favorite sweetener. And then you get some boiling water and heat up the ingredients and make them into shapes. I shoved them into a miniature turtle cake pan. And then once you get your shapes in there, then you put them in boiling water until you start to see them rise to the top. And it's a sweet version of something that our communities are very familiar with. And if you don't have access to our traditional heirloom corn flour, you can always use just masa, and it'll work just fine. So, and the thing that I would like everyone to walk away from is just to consider the balance in everything around us. I think a number of us talked about the offsets. You gain this, you lose that. If we just try to think of doing things with the environment and the animals around us in mind, and not just focusing on yield and profits.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for today's speakers, for your insights, for this conversation. Thank you to all of you who joined us today in this conversation. The recipes that each of our speakers just mentioned as their favorite corn dishes, as well as my favorite, which is my grandmother's popcorn balls for Halloween, are linked on the People and Planet page on IonE's website. We also have links to additional resources shared by our speakers, and these will be shared in a follow-up email this week as well. Finally, I encourage you to check out Becky's book, Our Precious Corn. I'm only about halfway through it, but it is super interesting. You can learn more about the Institute on the Environment on our webpage, environment.umn.edu, and be sure to check out our next People and Planet conversation about clean tech catalysts in Minnesota. That will be on Wednesday, November 29th. We look forward to hosting you again soon. Thank you all.